Chen sat in the circle of plastic chairs, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the worn linoleum floor. Around him, 6 other people shifted in their seats, none of them making eye contact. This was week 3 of the trauma recovery group, and David still wondered why he had agreed to come. His sister Emma had begged him for months. She had found this therapist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who supposedly specialized in helping veterans and survivors of violence work through their pain. David had finally agreed just to get Emma to stop worrying about him. That was 4 years after the incident that had shattered his life into pieces he could not figure out how to put back together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Mitchell was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore comfortable clothes, nothing fancy or clinical. She had a way of speaking that was gentle but direct, never patronizing. David appreciated that about her, even though he had not spoken more than 10 words in any of the sessions so far. He would sit in his chair, arms crossed, and listen to other people share their stories of loss and trauma. Sometimes their words would hit too close to home and he would have to focus on his breathing to keep from walking out. Other times he would feel a strange sense of relief knowing he was not alone in his suffering. The group was small and intimate. There was Patricia, a woman in her 60s whose husband had died suddenly, leaving her alone after 40 years of marriage. There was Marcus, a young man barely out of his teens who had survived a shooting at his high school. Angela was a nurse who had witnessed too much death during the pandemic and could not shake the nightmares. Robert was a firefighter who had pulled bodies from a collapsed building and had not been able to go back to work since. Janet was a mother whose teenage daughter had taken her own life. And then there was Kenji, a quiet man about David's age who never explained what had brought him to the group but whose eyes carried the same haunted look that David saw in his own mirror every morning. Dr. Mitchell always started the sessions the same way. She would welcome everyone, thank them for having the courage to show up, and remind them that this was a safe space where judgment did not exist. Then she would ask if anyone wanted to share how their week had been. Usually Patricia or Angela would speak first, breaking the ice for the others. David never volunteered. He came because he had promised Emma, but he was not ready to talk about what had happened to him. Some wounds were too deep to expose to strangers, even kind strangers who had their own scars. Tonight felt different somehow. Dr. Mitchell had that look in her eyes that suggested she had something planned. After the usual opening and a few people sharing updates about their week, she stood up and walked to the corner of the room. David had noticed the old upright piano sitting there during the first session. It was pushed against the wall, covered with a faded cloth, looking forgotten and out of place among the folding chairs and motivational posters. Dr. Mitchell pulled the cloth off, revealing the piano's dark wood surface, scratched and worn from decades of use. The group fell silent, watching her with curiosity. Dr. Mitchell ran her hand along the piano's edge, almost reverently. She turned to face them with a soft smile. She explained that she wanted to try something different today. She said that trauma lived in the body, not just the mind, and sometimes words were not enough to release the pain that people carried inside. Sometimes they needed other forms of expression. Music, she said, had a way of reaching parts of the soul that talk therapy could not touch. She asked if anyone in the group had ever played an instrument or had any connection to music. The room remained quiet. A few people shook their heads. Marcus said he had tried guitar once but gave it up after a few months. Patricia mentioned that she used to sing in a church choir many years ago but had not sung since her husband died. No one seemed particularly interested in where this was going. David felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly where this was going, and he did not like it one bit. Dr. Mitchell's eyes found him across the circle. David looked away quickly, staring at the floor, hoping she would move on to someone else. But he could feel her gaze lingering on him. She had a way of seeing through people's defenses, and David had the uncomfortable feeling that she knew something about him that he had not shared. She asked him directly, her voice gentle but impossible to ignore. She asked if he had ever played piano. David's heart started pounding. His hands, resting on his knees, began to tremble slightly. He pressed them down harder, trying to stop the shaking. Everyone in the group was looking at him now. He could feel their eyes, their curiosity, their expectation. His throat felt tight. He wanted to say no, to lie, to deflect. But something in Dr. Mitchell's patient expression made him tell the truth. He nodded once, barely perceptible. Yes, he had played piano. A long time ago. Dr. Mitchell smiled, not triumphantly, but with understanding. She asked if he would be willing to play something for the group. She said it did not have to be perfect or complicated. Just something simple. She said that sometimes the act of creating sound, of making something beautiful out of silence, could be incredibly healing. She promised that no one would judge him. This was a safe space. Everyone here understood what it meant to be vulnerable. David felt his chest constrict. The walls of the small room seemed to close in around him. He had not touched a piano in 4 years. Not since the night everything fell apart. Not since the night that had stolen everything he loved and left him hollow and broken. The piano had been central to his life before that night. It had been his passion, his career, his identity. And then it had become impossible. Every time he even thought about sitting at a piano, his hands would shake and his breathing would become shallow. The memories would crash over him like waves, drowning him in grief and guilt so overwhelming he could barely function. He shook his head. The word came out harsh and final. No. He could not do it. He would not do it. Dr. Mitchell nodded, accepting his refusal without pushing. She said that was perfectly fine. She understood. There was no pressure. If he changed his mind, the piano would be there. Then she moved on, asking if anyone else might want to try playing something, even if they had never touched a piano before. Sometimes, she said, just pressing the keys and hearing the sounds could be therapeutic. But David barely heard the rest of the session. His mind was somewhere else, pulled back into memories he had spent 4 years trying to escape. He was no longer sitting in a community center in Seattle. He was back in Boston, in the small apartment he had shared with his wife, Lily. He could see her face as clearly as if she were sitting right in front of him. Her dark eyes full of life and laughter. Her smile that could light up the darkest days. The way she would sit on the couch with a book while he practiced piano, occasionally looking up to watch him play, her expression soft with contentment. David had been a professional pianist. Not famous, but successful enough. He played in hotels and restaurants, private events and small concert halls. He taught piano lessons to supplement his income. He had dreamed of bigger stages, of recording albums, of making a name for himself in the classical music world. But he had been happy with his life. He had Lily. He had his music. That had been enough. More than enough. They had been married for 3 years when it happened. 3 years of the kind of happiness David had not known was possible. Lily was a teacher at an elementary school. She loved children and they loved her. She would come home with stories about her students that would make David laugh until his sides hurt. She was kind and patient and saw the good in everyone. She had believed in David's talent even when he doubted himself. She would sit through his practices, listening to him play the same passage over and over until he got it right, never complaining, always encouraging. The night it happened, David had been playing at a hotel downtown. It was a corporate event, background music for people who were not really listening. He had played these kinds of gigs 100 times. They paid well and were easy work. Lily had stayed home that night. She had a cold and wanted to rest. David had kissed her goodbye, told her he loved her, and promised to bring home soup on his way back. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. The kind of evening they had shared countless times before. David was halfway through his set when his phone started buzzing in his pocket. He ignored it at first. He was working. But it kept buzzing. Call after call. Something in his gut told him something was wrong. During a break, he checked his phone and saw 15 missed calls from his sister, from Lily's mother, from numbers he did not recognize. His hands shook as he called Emma back. Her voice was frantic, barely coherent through her tears. There had been a fire. The apartment building. Lily was inside. They could not get to her in time. David remembered very little of what happened next. He remembered running out of the hotel, leaving his keyboard and equipment behind. He remembered driving through red lights, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He remembered arriving at the apartment building to find it engulfed in flames, fire trucks everywhere, firefighters shouting, neighbors standing in the street in their pajamas, crying and holding each other. He remembered screaming Lily's name until his voice gave out. He remembered Emma pulling him back when he tried to run into the building. He remembered collapsing on the sidewalk, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to accept what was happening. The fire had started in the apartment below theirs. Faulty wiring, the investigators said later. It spread fast. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most people got out. But Lily had been asleep, weakened by her cold, and the smoke got to her before she could escape. By the time the firefighters reached her, it was too late. She was 28 years old. They had been planning to start a family that year. David did not remember the funeral. He did not remember the weeks that followed. Emma told him later that he had moved through those days like a ghost, barely speaking, barely eating. He had stayed with her for a month because he could not bear to find a new apartment, could not bear to sort through the few belongings that had survived the fire. Everything was gone. Lily. Their home. Their life together. All of it reduced to ash. What haunted David most was not just the loss. It was the guilt. The crushing, suffocating guilt that never left him. If he had been home that night instead of playing piano at some meaningless corporate event, maybe he would have woken up when the smoke started. Maybe he could have gotten them both out. Maybe Lily would still be alive. The piano, which had once been his greatest joy, became a symbol of everything he had lost. It was the reason he had not been there. It was the reason his wife had died alone and afraid. He could not forgive himself. And he could not touch a piano without feeling like he was betraying her memory all over again. For 4 years, David had existed rather than lived. He took a job doing data entry for an insurance company. It was mindless work that required nothing of him. He went through the motions of daily life. He paid his bills. He ate enough to survive. He saw Emma once a week because she insisted. But inside, he was hollow. The music that had once filled his soul was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like drowning. He had tried therapy before, different therapists, different approaches. Nothing helped. The pain was too deep, too entrenched. Until Emma found Dr. Mitchell and convinced him to try one more time. Now, sitting in this circle of broken people, David felt exposed in a way he had not anticipated. Dr. Mitchell had somehow seen through his carefully constructed walls. She had found the one thing he could not face and had asked him to confront it in front of strangers. Part of him was angry at her for pushing. But another part, a part he barely acknowledged, wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe he needed to face the piano again. Maybe that was the only way forward. But the thought terrified him more than anything had in 4 years. The session ended and people began to leave. David stood up quickly, eager to escape before Dr. Mitchell could approach him. But she caught him at the door. She asked if she could speak with him for just a moment. David wanted to refuse, but something in her eyes made him stay. The others filed out, leaving them alone in the room with the piano still uncovered in the corner. Dr. Mitchell did not waste time. She told David that she knew this was hard. She could see how much pain he was carrying. But she also saw something else. She saw a man who had lost his way and needed to find a path back to himself. The piano, she said, might be that path. She was not asking him to perform or impress anyone. She was asking him to try. To sit at the piano and see what happened. Even if it was just for a few minutes. Even if he played nothing at all. Sometimes, she said, just being willing to try was enough to start the healing process. David listened without responding. His throat felt too tight to speak. Dr. Mitchell did not push further. She simply told him to think about it and said she would see him next week. Then she let him go. David walked to his car in the dark parking lot, his mind spinning. He sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. The drive home was a blur. When he arrived at his small studio apartment, he went straight to bed without turning on the lights. But sleep would not come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the piano, about Lily, about the life he used to have and the empty shell he had become. The next morning, David called in sick to work. He could not face the office, could not pretend to care about insurance claims and spreadsheets. Instead, he drove aimlessly around the city, eventually finding himself in front of a music store. He had not been inside a music store in 4 years. He sat in his car across the street, watching people go in and out. A young girl came out carrying a violin case, her mother beside her, both of them smiling. An elderly man went in carrying what looked like sheet music. Regular people living regular lives where music was a source of joy, not pain. David got out of the car before he could change his mind. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. The store smelled like wood and rosin and old paper. Pianos lined one wall, from small keyboards to grand pianos that cost more than a car. David walked slowly past them, his hands in his pockets, not touching anything. A salesman approached and asked if he needed help. David shook his head and the man retreated, sensing David wanted to be left alone. David stopped in front of an upright piano, similar to the one in Dr. Mitchell's therapy room. He stared at the keys, black and white, perfectly arranged, waiting to be played. His hands trembled. He pulled them from his pockets and held them out in front of him. These hands had once created beautiful music. Now they shook at the mere thought of touching a piano. He curled them into fists and left the store quickly, the bell chiming again as the door swung shut behind him. The week passed slowly. David went to work, came home, ate microwave dinners, watched television without really seeing what was on the screen. Emma called twice. He let it go to voicemail both times. He knew she would ask about therapy, and he did not want to talk about it. Thursday night, unable to sleep, David found himself searching online for videos of people playing piano. He watched a young woman play Chopin with such emotion it brought tears to his eyes. He watched an old man with gnarled hands play a simple folk song with such tenderness it made David's chest ache. He watched until dawn, mesmerized and tortured in equal measure. When Tuesday came again, David almost did not go to group. He sat in his car in the community center parking lot, debating whether to just drive away. But something made him get out and walk inside. Maybe it was guilt over promising Emma he would give this an honest try. Maybe it was curiosity about what Dr. Mitchell would do next. Or maybe, buried deep beneath his fear and pain, there was a tiny spark of something that wanted to heal, that wanted to live again instead of just existing. The group assembled in the same circle. The piano was still there, uncovered, silent but present. Dr. Mitchell welcomed everyone and began the session the same way she always did. People shared about their week. Marcus talked about having a panic attack at the grocery store when he heard a loud noise. Patricia cried as she described going through her late husband's clothes and finally being able to donate them. Angela shared that she had returned to work part-time and while it was hard, it also felt good to be helping people again. Robert admitted he had driven past the fire station but had not been able to go inside yet. When it was David's turn to share, everyone looked at him expectantly. He usually stayed silent, but tonight Dr. Mitchell's eyes held his, and he found himself speaking before he realized what he was doing. His voice was rough from misuse. He said he had been thinking about what Dr. Mitchell had said last week. About the piano. About healing. He paused, swallowing hard. He said he wanted to tell them why he could not play. He needed them to understand. And then, for the first time in 4 years, David told the story. He told them about Lily. About the fire. About the guilt that consumed him every day. About how the piano had become a symbol of his failure to protect the person he loved most. His voice cracked and broke. Tears streamed down his face. But once he started, he could not stop. The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. The group listened in silence, their own eyes wet with empathy. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the sound of people crying softly. Dr. Mitchell let the silence settle. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. She thanked David for sharing his story. She acknowledged his pain and his guilt. But then she said something that made David's breath catch. She said that Lily would not want him to stop living. She would not want him to give up the thing he loved because of something that was not his fault. The fire was a tragedy, but it was not David's fault. He was not responsible for faulty wiring. He was not responsible for being at work. He was simply a man who had lost everything and was now punishing himself by refusing to live. She asked David to consider that maybe the best way to honor Lily's memory was not to abandon music, but to reclaim it. To play again, not despite his grief, but because of it. To transform his pain into something beautiful. David sat frozen, her words echoing in his mind. Around the circle, others nodded. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand. Marcus said quietly that he understood guilt, that he felt guilty every day for surviving when classmates had died. But he was learning that surviving meant he had a responsibility to actually live, not just exist. Angela added that honoring the dead sometimes meant choosing life, even when it felt impossible. The group, these strangers who had become something like family over these few weeks, surrounded David with their understanding and support. Dr. Mitchell stood and walked to the piano. She looked back at David. She said she was going to ask him again, and this time she hoped he would say yes. She asked if he would try to play something. Anything. She promised that whatever happened, the group would be there with him. He would not be alone. David's heart raced. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to run, to protect himself from the pain he knew would come. But something else was stirring inside him. A small voice, maybe Lily's voice, maybe his own, asking him to be brave. Asking him to try. David stood up on shaking legs. He walked toward the piano like a man walking to his own execution. Each step felt impossible. The group watched him in silence, holding their collective breath. Dr. Mitchell stepped aside, giving him space. David reached the piano bench and stood there, staring down at the keys. They gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights. His hands hung at his sides, trembling visibly now. He could not do this. He could not. But he thought of Lily. He thought of how she used to encourage him, how she believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. He thought of the life they had planned, the children they would never have, the future that had been stolen from them. And he thought that maybe, just maybe, she would want him to try. David sat down on the bench. It creaked slightly under his weight. He placed his hands on his thighs, not yet ready to touch the keys. He could feel everyone watching him, waiting. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then another. He remembered the music store, the videos he had watched, the young woman playing Chopin, the old man with the folk song. He remembered his grandmother who had first taught him piano when he was 5 years old, who had recognized his gift and nurtured it. He remembered countless hours of practice, the joy of finally mastering a difficult piece, the satisfaction of performing and seeing people moved by his playing. He remembered Lily sitting on the couch, her eyes closed, a small smile on her face as she listened to him play. That was what he wanted to remember. Not the fire. Not the guilt. But the joy. The love. The music that had once defined him. David lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. The smooth ivory felt foreign and familiar at the same time. He pressed one key. A single note rang out, clear and pure. The sound filled the small room. It was just one note, but it was everything. It was 4 years of silence breaking. It was grief beginning to transform into something else. David pressed another key. Then another. His fingers began to move, hesitantly at first, finding their way across the keyboard like someone relearning how to walk. The notes were halting and unsure. He hit wrong keys. His timing was off. But he kept going. And then something shifted. Muscle memory took over. His fingers found familiar patterns. The music began to flow more smoothly. David was playing a piece he had known since childhood, a simple melody his grandmother had taught him. It was not complex or showy. It was just honest and true. As he played, tears streamed down his face, but he did not stop. He poured 4 years of grief into the music. Every note carried his pain, his loss, his guilt, his love for Lily. The small room filled with sound, with emotion, with something sacred and raw. Around the circle, the group members began to cry. Not sad tears, but tears of witnessing something profound. Marcus covered his face with his hands. Patricia clutched her chest. Angela reached for Kenji's hand. Robert wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Janet sobbed openly. Dr. Mitchell stood with tears rolling down her cheeks, her hands clasped together. They were all being swept up in David's grief and in his courage. His willingness to be vulnerable, to face his greatest fear, gave them permission to feel their own pain more deeply. His music was not just his healing. It was becoming theirs too. David played for perhaps 3 minutes, though time seemed to stop. When the final note faded into silence, no one moved. The room held its breath. David sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his shoulders shaking with sobs. He had done it. He had played. And he had not fallen apart. He had not betrayed Lily's memory. If anything, he had honored it. He had remembered what it felt like to create something beautiful. To be alive. To be himself. Dr. Mitchell was the first to move. She walked over to David and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Her presence was enough. One by one, the others got up from their chairs and came to stand near David. They formed a circle around him and the piano, not crowding, just being present. Bearing witness to his pain and his breakthrough. Patricia was crying so hard she could barely stand. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders to steady her. Angela held Janet's hand. Robert stood with his arms crossed, nodding slowly, understanding in his eyes. Kenji, who never spoke, who never shared, walked up to David and placed both hands on David's shoulders, squeezing gently. It was a gesture of solidarity, of respect, of recognition. One survivor to another. After a long moment, David turned on the bench to face them. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red and swollen. But there was something different in his expression. Something that had not been there before. A tiny crack in the wall of his grief, letting in a sliver of light. He looked at each person, at their tear-stained faces, at the compassion and understanding radiating from them. These people, most of whom he had known for only 3 weeks, had witnessed the most vulnerable moment of his life. And they had not turned away. They had stayed. They had cried with him. They had held space for his pain. David's voice came out hoarse and broken, but the words were clear. He said thank you. Just those 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything he could not articulate. Thank you for not judging. Thank you for being here. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for making me feel less alone. The group responded with nods and murmurs and more tears. Dr. Mitchell suggested they all sit back down and take some time to process what had just happened. They returned to their circle, but everything felt different now. The energy in the room had shifted. Something significant had occurred, something that went beyond one man playing piano. They had all participated in a moment of collective healing. Dr. Mitchell asked each person to share, if they felt comfortable, about what they had experienced while David played. Patricia spoke first, her voice trembling. She said that listening to David play had made her feel her husband's presence more strongly than she had since he died. She said the music reminded her that love does not end with death, that the people we lose stay with us in ways we cannot always see or understand. Marcus said that David's courage to face his fear gave him hope that maybe he could face his own fears too. Maybe he could go back to school. Maybe he could stop letting the shooting define his entire life. Angela talked about how the music had touched something deep inside her, a part of herself she had buried under exhaustion and trauma. She said it reminded her why she became a nurse in the first place, to help people, to witness their humanity. Robert, the firefighter, took a long time before he could speak. When he did, his voice was thick with emotion. He said he had been at the fire that killed David's wife. He had not known until David shared his story, but he had been part of the crew that tried to reach her. He had carried her body out of the building. The revelation stunned everyone, especially David. Robert looked directly at David, tears streaming down his weathered face. He said he was sorry. He said he had tried. He said that fire had haunted him too, that it was one of the ones. That broke him, made him unable to continue doing the job he loved. He had been carrying guilt too, feeling like he had failed, like he should have gotten there faster, done more. David stared at Robert in shock. This man, this stranger in his therapy group, had been there that night. Had tried to save Lily. A wave of emotion crashed over David. But it was not anger or blame. It was understanding. Robert had his own trauma from that night. His own guilt. His own scars. David stood up and crossed the circle. Robert stood too, uncertain. David embraced him, both men sobbing, holding each other up. They cried for Lily, for all the people they could not save, for their own broken hearts and shattered dreams. The rest of the group watched, many of them crying again, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Two men connected by tragedy, finding unexpected healing in each other's presence. When they finally pulled apart, David looked at Robert and said what he had not been able to say to anyone, including himself, in 4 years. He said it was not Robert's fault. He said Robert had done everything he could. He said thank you for trying to save her, for being brave enough to run into that building. Robert nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Mitchell let the moment breathe before gently guiding them back to their seats. She said that sometimes healing comes from unexpected places. Sometimes we find connection and understanding where we least expect it. Tonight had been one of those times. The session ran long. Nobody wanted to leave. They sat together in that circle, bound by their shared pain and their shared hope, talking and crying and occasionally laughing as someone shared a memory that was bittersweet but beautiful. David felt something he had not felt in 4 years. He felt like he belonged somewhere. Like he was part of something. These people understood him in a way that no one else could. And he understood them. They were all survivors, all struggling, all trying to find their way back to life after tragedy had tried to destroy them. When they finally did leave, past 9 o'clock, David lingered behind. He stood looking at the piano for a long time. Dr. Mitchell stayed with him, gathering her things slowly, giving him space. Finally, David spoke without looking at her. He said he did not know if he could do it again. Play, he meant. He did not know if tonight was a one-time thing or the beginning of something. Dr. Mitchell said that was okay. He did not have to know. He just had to keep showing up. Keep trying. Keep being willing to be uncomfortable and vulnerable. That was where healing lived, in the willingness to feel pain instead of running from it. David nodded. He ran his hand along the piano's edge one more time. Then he turned and left, driving home through dark Seattle streets, rain beginning to spatter against his windshield. But for the first time in 4 years, the darkness did not feel quite so oppressive. There was a tiny spark of something inside him. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of hope. Maybe the idea that he could learn to live with his grief instead of being consumed by it. Maybe the understanding that Lily would not want him to stop living. She had loved him too much for that. Over the next few weeks, David continued attending group. He did not play piano again right away. But he talked more. He shared his feelings and memories. He listened to others with more attention and empathy. He felt himself slowly becoming part of the fabric of the group, contributing not just receiving. The connection with Robert deepened. They met for coffee outside of group sessions. They talked about the fire, about their respective guilt and trauma. They helped each other understand that they had both done the best they could with an impossible situation. That healing meant forgiving themselves, even when forgiveness felt impossible. On the 5th week, Dr. Mitchell asked David if he would be willing to play again. The group had been talking about different forms of expression and healing. She thought it might be powerful if David played while others allowed themselves to simply feel whatever came up. David's instinct was still to refuse. But the group encouraged him. They said his music had helped them last time. It had opened something in each of them. Patricia said that since hearing David play, she had been able to listen to her husband's favorite songs again without completely falling apart. Marcus said he had started keeping a journal, writing about his feelings, finding ways to express what was inside him. They all credited David's courage with inspiring their own small steps forward. So David agreed. He sat at the piano, less terrified this time, though still nervous. He played a different piece, something Lily had loved. A gentle, melancholy melody that spoke of love and loss and the bittersweet nature of memory. As he played, he watched the group. He saw Patricia close her eyes and sway slightly. He saw tears on Marcus's young face. He saw Angela's hands pressed against her heart. He saw Robert's head bowed, shoulders shaking. He saw Janet crying silently, and Kenji, always silent, with his eyes closed and the ghost of a smile on his lips, as if the music was taking him somewhere peaceful. And Dr. Mitchell, standing at the edge of the circle, watching over them all like a guardian, her face reflecting such compassion and hope. When he finished, the applause was soft and reverent. But more powerful than any standing ovation David had ever received in his former life. Because this was real. This was people thanking him not for his technical skill but for his emotional honesty. For his willingness to share his pain and in doing so, help them process their own. That night marked a turning point. David began playing regularly at the start or end of sessions. It became a ritual. People would request certain types of music based on what they needed to feel or release. Sometimes David would play something somber and heavy, allowing space for grief. Other times he would play something lighter, reminding them that joy could still exist alongside sorrow. Word spread through the community center about what was happening in Dr. Mitchell's group. Other therapists and counselors began to ask if their clients could join. But Dr. Mitchell kept the group small and intimate. She knew that what was happening here was special and fragile. It required trust and safety that could only exist in a small circle of committed people. But she did arrange for David to play at a community gathering one evening, a fundraiser for trauma survivors. David was nervous playing in front of a larger audience, but the group came to support him. They sat in the front row, familiar faces giving him strength. David played for 20 minutes, a mix of classical pieces and improvisations. The audience was mesmerized. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People came up afterward wanting to know who he was, where he had trained, why they had never heard of him. David deflected most questions, uncomfortable with attention. But Emma, who had come to watch, stood beside him with tears of joy on her face. She told him how proud she was. How proud Lily would be. That night, driving his sister home, David admitted something he had not said out loud before. He said he thought he might want to start teaching piano again. Not performing, not yet. But teaching. Sharing music with others. Maybe working with kids or other trauma survivors. Using music as a form of healing the way Dr. Mitchell had used it with him. Emma encouraged him enthusiastically. Within a month, David had reached out to a few community centers and churches, offering to teach free piano lessons to anyone interested. He started with 3 students. A shy teenage girl who had anxiety. An elderly man who had always wanted to learn but never had the time. And a middle-aged woman going through a divorce who said she needed something beautiful in her life. David found that teaching brought him unexpected joy. He was patient and encouraging, never pushing, always meeting students where they were. His own trauma made him especially attuned to their struggles and fears. He knew what it was like to be afraid. To doubt yourself. To feel like you had lost your way. Months passed. The seasons changed. Seattle's gray winter gave way to spring rain and then finally to summer sun. David continued with therapy group, though the composition changed as some people graduated and moved on while new members joined. But the core group remained. Patricia, Marcus, Angela, Robert, Janet, Kenji, and David. They had become a family of sorts. People who had been strangers brought together by pain and bound together by their commitment to healing. They celebrated small victories together. Marcus going back to school. Patricia finding a new volunteer position at the hospital where her husband had worked. Angela taking on more shifts and rediscovering her passion for nursing. Robert visiting the fire station and having coffee with his old crew, not ready to go back yet but no longer avoiding them completely. Janet starting a support group for parents who had lost children. Kenji finally sharing his story one night, revealing he had survived a car accident that killed his entire family, and the group surrounding him with the same love and support they had all received. David's student base grew. He was teaching 15 students now, ranging from age 7 to 70. He rented a small studio space with a decent piano. His income was modest but enough to live on. More importantly, he felt purpose again. He felt connected to life in a way he had not since before Lily died. He still missed her every single day. The grief had not disappeared. But it had transformed into something he could carry without being crushed by it. He could think of her now and smile at the memories instead of only feeling the pain of loss. He could look at their wedding photo, which he had finally put back up in his apartment, and feel gratitude for the years they had together instead of only rage at how few those years were. One evening after group, Dr. Mitchell asked David if he would consider doing something bigger. There was a regional conference coming up for mental health professionals focused on innovative approaches to trauma therapy. She wanted to present their group's work and she wanted David to play as part of the presentation. She wanted to show other therapists how powerful music could be as a healing tool. David felt the old fear rise up. Speaking in front of professionals. Being examined and analyzed. But then he thought about how much Dr. Mitchell had done for him, how she had seen him when he was invisible to himself, how she had pushed him gently but firmly toward healing. He owed her this. More than that, if his story and his music could help other people find healing, he owed it to them too. The conference was held in Portland 2 months later. David drove down with several members of the group who wanted to support him. They got hotel rooms and made a weekend of it. The night before the presentation, they all had dinner together at a restaurant overlooking the Willamette River. The conversation was light and full of laughter. Looking around the table at these people who had become so important to him, David felt overwhelmed with gratitude. A year ago he had been alone, hollow, barely existing. Now he was surrounded by people who knew his worst pain and still chose to be in his life. People he had helped and who had helped him in return. The presentation was in a large conference room with perhaps 200 mental health professionals in attendance. Dr. Mitchell spoke first, explaining her approach to trauma therapy, the importance of creating safe spaces, the value of creative expression alongside traditional talk therapy. Then she introduced David. He walked onto the small stage, his heart pounding, and sat at the conference center's piano. He had prepared remarks, a brief explanation of his story, but when he opened his mouth, different words came out. He talked about Lily. About the fire. About the 4 years of silence. About the night Dr. Mitchell asked him to play. About how music had saved his life by giving him a way to express grief that words could not contain. His voice shook but he kept going, aware of the complete silence in the room, of people leaning forward to hear every word. Then he played. He chose a piece he had composed himself over the past few months. It was his story in music. It started dark and dissonant, representing the chaos of loss. Then it moved through phases of anger and despair, the notes crashing and violent. Gradually it began to shift, finding moments of light, brief melodic phrases that suggested hope before falling back into darkness. But each time the light returned it lasted longer, grew stronger. By the end, the music was not happy exactly, but it was peaceful. Accepting. It acknowledged pain while also affirming life. When the final notes faded, David sat with his hands in his lap, breathing deeply, feeling exposed and vulnerable and also somehow proud. The silence lasted several seconds. Then the applause began. It started softly but built quickly into something powerful. People stood. The applause continued for minutes. David looked out at the sea of faces and saw many people crying. Mental health professionals who worked with trauma every day, who thought they had seen everything, were moved to tears by one man's story and his music. When the applause finally subsided and people sat back down, the questions began. Therapists wanted to know more about the process. How had Dr. Mitchell known to push David toward the piano? How had she created safety in the group? What were the mechanisms at work? Could this approach be replicated? Dr. Mitchell and David spent an hour answering questions. Several therapists approached afterward wanting to connect, to learn more, to potentially implement similar approaches in their own practices. David gave them his email address, still amazed that anyone would want to hear from him. One woman, a therapist who worked with military veterans, told David that she had lost her brother to suicide after he returned from deployment. She said David's music had helped her access grief she had been holding at bay for years. She thanked him through tears and David found himself hugging this stranger, both of them crying, both of them understanding loss in a way that needed no explanation. The weekend in Portland became a celebration. The group went out that night, found a karaoke bar, and convinced David to play piano while they sang terribly and laughed until their sides hurt. It was absurd and joyful and exactly what they all needed. Marcus got up and sang a ridiculous pop song from the 80s. Patricia did a surprisingly good rendition of an old Torch song. Even Kenji, Quiet Kenji, got up and sang in a language David did not recognize, something beautiful and melancholy from his childhood. They stayed until the bar closed, then walked back to their hotels through Portland's quiet streets, arms around each other's shoulders, a band of survivors who had found their way back to living. When David returned to Seattle, he found several emails waiting from therapists who had been at the conference. 2 wanted to hire him to come play for their trauma groups. 1 wanted to collaborate on a research study about music and healing. Another invited him to speak at her clinic. David was overwhelmed but also energized. This was becoming bigger than he had imagined. What had started as his own desperate need for healing was turning into something that could help many people. He accepted the invitations, starting to build what was becoming a new career. Not performing in hotels and restaurants for people who were not really listening, but playing for people who needed the music, who were using it to process pain and find their way back to themselves. His teaching practice continued to grow as well. He was now working with 25 students and had a waiting list. He hired another teacher, a young woman named Sophie who had her own story of trauma and recovery, to help handle the demand. Together they created a small music school focused on teaching piano as a form of healing and self-expression rather than just technical mastery. They offered scholarships to students who could not afford lessons. They partnered with social service agencies to provide free lessons to foster children and domestic violence survivors. The studio became a community hub, a place where broken people could come and find beauty and connection. David's relationship with his sister deepened. Emma had always been there for him, but now he was able to be there for her too. When she went through a difficult breakup, David was the one she called. He listened and supported her the way she had supported him through his darkest days. They had dinner together twice a week now, sometimes just the 2 of them, sometimes with members of David's therapy group who had become part of his extended family. Emma loved Patricia especially, the 2 of them bonding over their shared love of old movies and gossip about Emma's coworkers. A year and a half after that first night when Dr. Mitchell had asked him to play, David received an unexpected email. It was from a journalist who had been at the Portland conference. She wanted to write a feature story about David for a national magazine. She had been moved by his presentation and thought his story could inspire others who were struggling with grief and trauma. David's first instinct was to refuse. He did not want attention or recognition. This was not about him becoming some kind of public figure. But Dr. Mitchell encouraged him to consider it. She pointed out that his story could reach people who desperately needed hope, who felt alone in their pain, who could not imagine ever feeling whole again. If David's experience could show even one person that healing was possible, was it not worth the discomfort of being in the spotlight? David agreed to the interview. The journalist, a woman named Rebecca Chen, came to Seattle and spent 3 days with him. She sat in on a therapy group session with everyone's permission. She watched him teach piano lessons. She interviewed Emma and Dr. Mitchell and several of his students. She asked David to take her to the site where his apartment building had been. It had been rebuilt now, new condos standing where his life with Lily had ended. David had not been back since the night of the fire. Standing there with Rebecca, looking up at the building, David felt the familiar grief rise up. But it did not overwhelm him the way it once would have. He could stand in this place and remember Lily and miss her and also know that he was going to be okay. The article was published 3 months later in a major national magazine. It was titled "The Man Who Found His Voice Through Silence." It told David's story with sensitivity and depth, including quotes from therapy group members about how his music had helped them heal. It discussed the power of creative expression in trauma recovery. It included information about how readers could support music therapy programs in their communities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. David's email inbox filled with messages from people around the country, around the world, sharing their own stories of loss and thanking him for giving them hope. Some asked if he did online sessions. Others wanted to know how to find similar programs in their areas. Many just wanted to tell him that his story had made them feel less alone. David tried to respond to as many as he could. Some nights he would stay up until midnight reading emails and sending thoughtful replies. He connected people with resources in their communities. He offered encouragement and validation. He shared what had worked for him while acknowledging that everyone's healing journey was different. The volume became too much for one person to handle, so he worked with Dr. Mitchell to create a website with resources, information about trauma recovery, links to therapy programs, and a forum where people could connect with each other. The site got thousands of visitors in the first week. News outlets picked up the story. David was invited to appear on morning talk shows and podcasts. He declined most of them, uncomfortable with the idea of becoming a media personality. But he did agree to a few interviews where he felt he could have substantive conversations about trauma and healing rather than just telling his story for entertainment value. One podcast interview with a host who specialized in mental health topics went viral, downloaded over 1 million times. David talked for 2 hours about his journey, about the importance of community and healing, about how creativity could provide pathways to processing pain that traditional therapy sometimes missed. The attention was exhausting but also meaningful. David heard from so many people whose lives had been shattered by loss, who felt stuck in their grief, who could not imagine ever feeling joy again. He told them what Dr. Mitchell had told him, that healing did not mean forgetting or moving on. It meant learning to carry grief without being crushed by it. It meant honoring the past while still choosing to live in the present. He told them about the piano, about how facing his greatest fear had been the beginning of reclaiming his life. He encouraged them to find their own version of the piano, whatever creative or meaningful practice could help them reconnect with themselves. Through all of this, David continued with his weekly therapy group. No matter how busy his schedule became, Tuesday nights were sacred. He showed up every week, played for the group when asked, shared his struggles and victories, listened to others with the same attention and compassion they had shown him. New members joined and David welcomed them the way he had been welcomed, creating space for their pain, offering hope through his own example of healing. Some of the original members graduated from the group, ready to move forward on their own. Patricia got remarried to a kind widower she met at the hospital. Marcus finished his degree and got accepted to graduate school. Angela was promoted to head nurse in her unit. Robert finally returned to the fire department, though in a different role. He could not go back to active firefighting, but he became a trainer, teaching new recruits and sharing his experience. He and David remained close friends, getting together for lunch every few weeks, their bond forged by shared tragedy and mutual understanding. Janet's support group for bereaved parents grew into a non-profit organization serving families across the state. Kenji stayed in therapy longer, his trauma deeper and more complex, but he too began to open up more, to smile more, to engage with life beyond his pain. Dr. Mitchell watched her group members heal and move forward with pride and satisfaction. But she was also careful to remind them, and herself, that healing was not linear. There would be setbacks and hard days. Anniversaries of losses would still hurt. Unexpected triggers would still cause pain. The work of healing was ongoing, a practice rather than a destination. David experienced this truth repeatedly. Some days were easy, filled with music and teaching and connection. Other days the grief would hit him like a physical blow, usually triggered by something small and unexpected. A song on the radio that Lily had loved. A couple laughing together on the street. The smell of her perfume on a stranger passing by. On those hard days, David had learned to be gentle with himself. He did not try to push the grief away or judge himself for still hurting. He let himself feel it. Sometimes he would go to his studio and play, pouring the pain into music. Sometimes he would call Emma or Robert and talk until the worst of it passed. Sometimes he would just sit with the grief, acknowledging it, breathing through it, trusting that it would ease eventually. And it always did. The waves of pain grew further apart over time. They became less overwhelming. He learned to ride them instead of being drowned by them. 2 years after that first night at the piano, David decided to do something he had been avoiding. He wanted to create a memorial for Lily. Not a gravestone, she had been cremated and her ashes scattered in the ocean she loved, but something lasting that honored her memory and her impact on his life. He worked with a local artist to commission a bench for a park near where they used to live. The bench had a plaque that read in memory of Lily Chen, teacher, wife, beloved. She brought light to every life she touched. David added a QR code that linked to a website where people could learn about Lily, read stories from her former students and colleagues, and make donations to an education charity in her name. The bench was installed on a sunny afternoon in early fall. David invited Emma, Dr. Mitchell, and the core therapy group members to the dedication. They gathered around the bench, a small circle of people who had never met Lily but who knew her through David's stories and grief. Patricia brought flowers. Marcus read a poem he had written. Angela said a prayer. Robert stood with his hand on David's shoulder, solid and present. Janet shared how David's healing had inspired her own journey toward peace after losing her daughter. Kenji simply bowed his head in respect, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could. David sat on the bench and looked around at these people, this chosen family born from pain and commitment to healing. He thought about how different his life was now compared to 2 years ago. How he had been a ghost then, barely existing, consumed by guilt and grief. How these people, especially Dr. Mitchell with her compassion and wisdom, had helped him find his way back to living. How music, which he had thought was lost to him forever, had become his salvation and his purpose. He thought about Lily and how much she would have liked these people. How she would have been proud of what he had built from the ashes of their life together. David stood and thanked everyone for coming, for supporting him, for being part of his healing journey. He sat at a small keyboard he had brought and played a piece he had composed specifically for this occasion. It was called Lily's Light and it captured everything he felt about his late wife. The love and the loss, the joy of having known her and the sorrow of having lost her too soon, the gratitude for their time together and the acceptance that life continues even after the worst happens. When he finished playing, there was not a dry eye in the group. Emma came and hugged her brother tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up. Thank you for finding your way back." The memorial bench became a place David visited regularly. He would bring his coffee on Saturday mornings and sit there, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching people pass by. Families with children, elderly couples holding hands, joggers and dog walkers and teenagers absorbed in their phones. Life in all its messy, beautiful variety. He would think about Lily and imagine what she might say about all the changes in his life. He believed she would be happy for him. Proud of him for facing his fear and reclaiming his music. Glad that he was helping others heal. He talked to her sometimes, out loud when no one was around, sharing updates about his students and the therapy group and the work he was doing. It brought him comfort to feel that connection, to keep her memory alive through continuing conversation. David's work continued to expand. He was invited to speak at universities and conferences around the country. He collaborated with researchers studying the neuroscience of music and trauma. He trained other therapists in incorporating music into their practices. He worked with hospitals to create music therapy programs for patients dealing with serious illness and injury. Every opportunity to share what he had learned, to help others find healing through music, felt like honoring Lily's memory. She had believed in his talent when he doubted it. She had supported his dreams. Now he was using that talent to make a difference in people's lives. It felt like the best possible tribute to her. But David also made sure to maintain boundaries. He turned down opportunities that felt more about celebrity than substance. He protected his time with students and therapy group. He took days off to rest and recharge. He had learned the hard way what happened when you pushed yourself too hard, when you did not honor your own needs and limits. Burnout had nearly destroyed him in his old career, always chasing the next gig, the next opportunity, never satisfied with what he had. Now he was more intentional. He said no to things that did not align with his values. He prioritized depth over breadth, connection over achievement. His teaching practice stabilized at around 30 students. He and Sophie had developed a strong partnership, complementing each other's strengths. Sophie was better with young children while David excelled with teens and adults. They created specialized programs for different populations, including a group class for veterans with PTSD where music became a way to process combat trauma. The studio felt like a sacred space, walls covered with student art and photos, a community board where people posted announcements and encouragement. Every student who walked through the door was welcome not just as a client but as a member of a family dedicated to healing and growth. 3 years after beginning his healing journey, David met someone. Her name was Rachel Torres and she was a music therapist who had reached out after reading the magazine article about him. They had corresponded by email for months, sharing ideas about trauma and healing and the power of creative expression. When she came to Seattle for a conference, they met for coffee. The conversation flowed easily, both of them passionate about their work, both of them understanding what it meant to carry loss. Rachel was a widow too. Her husband had died from cancer 5 years earlier. She had 2 young children and had rebuilt her life through music therapy, finding purpose in helping others while processing her own grief. David and Rachel began dating slowly, both of them cautious, both carrying wounds that made trust difficult. David was terrified of losing someone again, of opening his heart and having it shattered. But Rachel understood. She felt the same fear. They talked about their late spouses openly, keeping their memories alive rather than treating them as forbidden topics. David told Rachel stories about Lily. Rachel shared memories of her husband Miguel. They acknowledged that they would not be together if tragedy had not visited both their lives, a strange reality that felt both wrong and right simultaneously. The therapy group noticed the change in David. He seemed lighter, more open, capable of joy in a way he had not been before. When he finally introduced Rachel to the group 6 months into their relationship, everyone welcomed her warmly. Patricia immediately wanted to know all the details. Marcus joked that David was glowing. Angela said she could tell Rachel was special by the way David looked at her. Robert gave his approval in his gruff firefighter way, saying she seemed solid and real. Dr. Mitchell smiled knowingly, having suspected David was ready for this next chapter even before he knew it himself. Rachel's children, Sophia and Daniel, ages 8 and 6, were initially shy around David. He did not push, just let them get comfortable at their own pace. He brought his keyboard to Rachel's house and would play while they drew or did homework. Gradually they warmed up to him. Sophia asked if he could teach her piano. Daniel wanted to know if David liked dinosaurs because that was Daniel's current obsession. David found himself caring deeply about these children, wanting to be a positive presence in their lives, aware that he was not trying to replace their father but could still offer them something valuable. One evening, about a year into his relationship with Rachel, David had dinner with Emma. She asked him directly if he thought he could see a future with Rachel and the kids. David thought carefully before answering. He said yes, he could. He said it felt different from what he had with Lily, not better or worse but different. He would always love Lily. She would always be part of him. But he also believed, had come to believe through his healing work, that the heart had infinite capacity. Loving Rachel did not diminish what he had felt for Lily. It was possible to honor the past while embracing the future. Emma reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her eyes wet. She said she was so proud of him, of how far he had come, of the man he had become through facing his pain instead of running from it. David proposed to Rachel 2 years after they met. It was simple and private, just the two of them on a weekend trip to the coast. He told her he knew it was complicated, blending families and carrying the memories of their late spouses into a new relationship. But he loved her and loved her children. He wanted to build a life together if she was willing. Rachel said yes through tears, admitting she had been afraid to hope for this, afraid to want it too much. They set a wedding date for the following spring, giving everyone time to adjust to the idea, to process their feelings about moving forward. The therapy group threw David an engagement party, a surprise celebration at the community center after a regular session. They had decorated with streamers and brought cake. Everyone made toasts. Patricia said David had taught them all that healing was possible, that life after loss could still be beautiful. Marcus credited David with showing him what courage looked like. Angela thanked him for creating space for all of them to be vulnerable and real. Robert, typically stoic, got choked up saying that David was like a brother to him, that pulling Lily from the fire that night had haunted him for years, but knowing David had found peace and love again helped Robert forgive himself. The group surrounded David and Rachel, celebrating not just the engagement but the journey that had brought them all together. Dr. Mitchell pulled David aside during the party. She told him she wanted him to know how proud she was. She said that first night when she had asked him to play the piano, she had not been certain it would work. She had been taking a risk, following her intuition that music was the key to unlocking his grief. Watching him heal, watching him help others heal, had been one of the most rewarding experiences of her career. She thanked him for trusting her, for being brave enough to face his. Hugged her, this woman who had saved his life by seeing him when he could not see himself, by pushing him toward the thing he feared most, by creating a space where healing was possible. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the same park where Lily's memorial bench sat. David and Rachel wanted their late spouses to be part of the day in some way. During the ceremony, they acknowledged Lily and Miguel, expressing gratitude for the love they had known and the lessons learned through loss. They released balloons, one for each person they had lost, watching them rise into the spring sky. Sophia and Daniel stood with their mother, part of the ceremony, David promising to love and honor them as well. Emma was maid of honor. Robert was best man. The therapy group sat in the front rows, this chosen family that had been born from pain and forged in the fires of shared healing. At the reception, David played piano while Rachel sang, their first performance as husband and wife. They chose a song about second chances and hope after darkness. There was not a dry eye in the small gathering. Later, after the formal festivities, when it was just family and close friends, David sat at the piano with Sophia on one side and Daniel on the other. He taught them a simple duet, their small hands finding the keys under his guidance. Rachel watched from across the room, her hand over her heart, seeing this man who had been so broken now creating beauty and joy with her children. This was healing. This was hope. This was what it meant to choose life even after death had tried to destroy you. The years that followed brought their own challenges and joys. Blending families was not always easy. Sophia struggled with divided loyalties, loving David but feeling like she was betraying her father's memory. Daniel had nightmares and separation anxiety. Rachel and David had to learn to navigate parenting together, their different styles and approaches sometimes clashing. There were hard conversations and tears and moments of doubt. But they faced each challenge as a team, committed to the family they were building together. They went to family therapy, not because things were falling apart but because they wanted tools to do this well. They created rituals that honored both Miguel and Lily while making space for their new family identity. David continued his work with trauma survivors, now with an even deeper understanding of healing's complexity. He knew firsthand that recovery was not a straight line. There were setbacks and struggles and days when old grief would rise up unexpectedly. But there was also joy and connection and the profound satisfaction of helping others find their way through darkness. His student base remained steady. He still played at therapy groups and conferences. He wrote a book about his experience, the proceeds going to fund music therapy programs in underserved communities. The book became a bestseller, not because it promised easy answers but because it told the truth about grief and healing with unflinching honesty. On the 5th anniversary of that first night when Dr. Mitchell had asked him to play, David organized a reunion of everyone who had ever been part of the therapy group. Over 50 people showed up at the community center, some who had been there from the beginning and others who had joined later. They shared a meal and told stories and laughed and cried together. David played piano, of course, and several others shared their own creative expressions. Patricia read poetry she had been writing. Marcus showed a short film he had made about his recovery. Angela led them in a guided meditation. They all bore witness to each other's journeys, celebrating how far they had come while acknowledging that healing was ongoing work. Dr. Mitchell announced she was retiring from active practice. She was in her 60s now and ready to step back. But she wanted them to know the group would continue under new leadership. She had trained 2 younger therapists who would take over facilitating the sessions. The group was her legacy, this community of healers and survivors who had taught her as much as she had taught them. She looked at David when she said this, her eyes shining. He had been her greatest teacher, showing her what was possible when someone had the courage to face their deepest pain. The group gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, everyone understanding the debt they owed this wise, compassionate woman who had created space for their healing. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, David found himself standing in front of the piano, the same piano where his healing had begun 5 years earlier. He ran his hands over the keys, thinking about everything that had happened since that terrifying night when he had forced himself to play. He thought about Lily and how much he still missed her. He thought about Rachel and Sophia and Daniel waiting for him at home. He thought about all the students he had taught, all the people he had connected with through his music and his story. He thought about the man he had been, hollow and broken, and the man he had become, still scarred but also whole, still grieving but also capable of joy. Robert came over and stood beside him. The 2 men did not speak for a moment, just stood together in comfortable silence. Finally Robert said what they were both thinking. That fire stole a lot from both of them. But it also, in some strange way, gave them something. A deeper understanding of what mattered. A appreciation for life's fragility and preciousness. A capacity for compassion that could only come from surviving hell. They would not have chosen this path. They would give anything to undo that night. But since they could not, they had learned to find meaning in the suffering. To transform tragedy into purpose. To help others by sharing what they had learned in the darkness. David nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Robert clapped him on the shoulder and walked away, leaving David alone with the piano. David sat down on the bench one more time. He played softly, just for himself, a melody that had no name. It contained everything he felt. Grief and joy. Pain and hope. Loss and love. It was the sound of a man who had been broken and put himself back together, not perfectly but honestly. It was the sound of healing. When he finished, he sat for another moment in the silence. Then he stood, turned off the lights, and walked out into the night where his family was waiting. Where his life, hard won and precious, was waiting. Where tomorrow, he would wake up and do the work again. Teaching. Playing. Healing. Choosing life. Every single day, choosing life. David stood at Lily's memorial bench 10 years later, surrounded by his expanded family. Sophia and Daniel, now teenagers, had become accomplished musicians themselves. Rachel squeezed his hand as their youngest daughter practiced scales on a nearby keyboard. The therapy group still met monthly, now led by former members. Dr. Mitchell visited occasionally, smiling at the legacy she had created. David had transformed his pain into purpose, teaching hundreds of students and helping countless survivors discover healing through music. He would always carry Lily's memory, but he had learned that grief and joy could coexist. Life after loss was possible. Beautiful, even. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.